She couldn't feel the warmth of a fever. She couldn't sense the flutter of a fragile pulse, or the texture of a child's hand reaching for comfort. Her fingers were numb, her palms unresponsive, and every shift reminded her this body wasn't built for nursing, because how do you care for others when you can't feel them at all? They told her it was impossible, that she'd miss vital signs, that a nurse who can't feel is a danger, not a healer. But they were wrong, because while she couldn't feel pain, she could recognize it in others before they said a word. While she couldn't feel texture, she could read faces like pages in a book. And while she couldn't feel a heartbeat beneath her skin, she could steady one with her presence, with her voice, with something far stronger than sensation, empathy. This isn't a story about what hands can't do. It's about what the heart can, and what happens when someone refuses to let their limitations limit their love. She was told she'd never touch a life, but every patient she met still feels her care today. Her name was Grace Ito, Filipina Japanese, 32 years old, a trauma nurse in one of Chicago's busiest public hospitals. From the outside, she looked like any other nurse on the ward. Scrubs tied tight, hair pulled back, walking fast with that quiet urgency all nurses seem to master. But Grace carried a secret she didn't always have words for. Her hands had stopped speaking to her. It started small. When she was 15, she dropped a glass in the kitchen and couldn't explain why she hadn't felt it slipping. Later, she'd burn her fingertips on a hot mug, but wouldn't feel the pain until she saw the red marks hours later. Sometimes her hands would buzz, as if electricity was trapped under her skin. Other times, she couldn't feel them at all. Just dead weight hanging from her wrists. At 17, she was diagnosed with peripheral neuropathy, a rare nerve condition often reserved for the elderly or diabetics. But Grace, she was healthy, athletic, ambitious, and suddenly told that her hands would never be normal again. Doctors were blunt. You'll likely lose fine motor function, no more piano, no surgery, definitely no career in medicine. One neurologist even chuckled and said, "Sorry, sweetheart, some dreams just aren't built for broken wiring." But Grace had grown up in a family of caregivers. Her grandmother was a midwife in the Philippines, her mother a hospice worker. And Grace? She wasn't inspired by the drama of saving lives. She was moved by the quiet parts, the way her mother washed the hair of a dying patient like it was sacred, the way her grandmother whispered to newborns before they even opened their eyes. She didn't want to become a nurse because she loved medicine. She wanted to become one because she believed in human dignity, in presence, in care that stayed even when the cure didn't. But now, her very hands, her tools, had betrayed her. She kept asking herself, how do you give comfort if you can't feel your own touch? How do you catch someone falling if your fingers can't grip? Still, she refused to accept the verdict. Grace enrolled in nursing school anyway. She didn't tell many people about her condition, just kept gloves in her bag, practiced dexterity drills until her fingers cramped, and learned to listen with every sense except touch. But textbooks and theory were one thing. The real test would come the first time she had to touch someone in pain and couldn't feel a thing. Nursing school wasn't built for people like Grace. The curriculum was rigid. The checklists were unforgiving. And the unspoken rule was simple. If your hands can't feel, you can't heal. By the end of her first semester, Grace had already fallen behind. Her vitals check was off by a beat. Her blood draw attempts, too slow, and when it came time for the fourth placement practicum, she failed twice. The instructor noted in red, lacks tactile feedback, unsafe in emergency context. Other students whispered when she walked past, she's the one who can't feel her hands, right? She'll never make it past clinicals. And truthfully, Grace began to believe them. Each night, she'd stay after class, practicing her techniques on silicone arms and oranges. Her fingers would go numb after minutes, but she kept going, eyes closed, breath steady, trying to build a sense of pressure she could no longer feel. Her instructors noticed. Most turned a blind eye, except for one, Ms. Connolly, a former combat nurse with a scar down her temple and a calm, commanding voice. She pulled Grace aside one day and said, "Let me ask you something. What's the most important skill in nursing?" Grace mumbled something about precision, technique, speed. Miss Connolly shook her head. "No, the most important skill is presence. You want to be a good nurse? Learn how to show up. Really show up. With your eyes, your breath, your voice. If your hands can't feel, then you see for them. You listen for them. You build a new kind of touch." And that changed everything. Grace retrained herself from the inside out. She memorized vein patterns and studied how light reflected off swelling. She listened to the rhythm of breathing like it was music. She timed each movement to the patient's reactions instead of her own sensation. She even blindfolded herself during training, forcing her body to rely on sight and memory alone. And when she passed her fourth placement exam, the third time, the room went silent, then a single clap, then another, until the entire class was on their feet. It wasn't about perfection, it was about defiance, about rewriting the rules of care. Grace wasn't just passing nursing school, she was redefining what it meant to be a nurse. But classrooms are safe, hospitals are not. And soon, Grace would have to prove herself all over again, in a place where seconds could mean life or death. Graduation didn't feel like a finish line for Grace, it felt like a dare. The real world didn't care about her certificate, didn't care that she'd passed her IV exam blindfolded, didn't care that she'd memorized every vein map, every pulse point. The hospital floor was different, louder, faster, less forgiving. She landed a night shift position in the intensive care unit, the place where lives hung in limbo, where alarms became a second language, and where nurses didn't just administer care, they anticipated crisis before it arrived. For Grace, every night was a test, not just of skill, but of trust. Colleagues eyed her cautiously. Some wouldn't say it aloud, but she felt it. Doubt, suspicion, fear that her condition might cost someone their life. So she had to be twice as prepared, twice as thorough, and sometimes twice as alone. She never hid her neuropathy, but she also didn't ask for exceptions. She adapted. Grace wore specialized haptic gloves that translated pressure into subtle vibrations along her wrists. She carried a portable visual pulse oximeter, kept emergency cheat sheets laminated in her scrub pocket. When other nurses relied on instinct, she relied on pattern recognition, body language, minute changes in color, rhythm, breath. One of the senior nurses, Tamika, once told her, "I don't know how you do it. You can't feel a thing, but you notice everything." And patients, they noticed too. They didn't know her diagnosis. They didn't care. What they felt was how she pulled a chair closer to their bed instead of standing distant. How she made eye contact while explaining every step of a procedure. how her presence slowed the chaos like an anchor in the middle of a storm. There was one moment early on that cemented her presence. A young woman, 22, brought in after a failed suicide attempt, tubes in her nose, restraints on her wrists. Most staff were instructed to observe, keep space, but Grace sat beside her for hours, didn't speak much, just listened to the silence. And when the girl finally opened her eyes, she didn't ask for the doctor. She whispered, "Are you the one who stayed?" Grace nodded, and the girl cried, not because someone had healed her, but because someone had refused to look away. In a place filled with the best machines, the sharpest tools, the fastest hands. Grace's numb hands became irrelevant because she had mastered something nursing school couldn't teach: the ability to hold space for someone without needing to touch them. But what happens when you have to act fast, precise, and physical in a life or death emergency? Could Grace still deliver when seconds were everything? It was a Tuesday night, the kind where the ICU buzzed at a low hum, machines blinking, staff pacing, time stretching. Grace was in room 7, adjusting a feed-in line for a stroke patient when it happened. Code blue, trauma room 3, code blue. The intercom cut through the calm like a blade. Everyone moved, fast. Grace sprinted down the corridor with the crash cart, her shoes hitting the tile like gunshots. In trauma 3, it was chaos. A young man, early 30s, motorcycle accident, bleeding out, chest compressions in progress, shattered ribs, head trauma, no time for pleasantries, no time for doubt. The trauma lead barked, "Get a line in, now." And forth fast, deep, precise. But the usual nurse hadn't arrived, and the team was short. All eyes turned to Grace. She hesitated only for a second. Her fingers tingled from adrenaline, not sensation. She couldn't feel the vein, couldn't rely on her gloves, which were slick from another patient's emergency. And then she remembered something Ms. Connolly once said: "You don't need to feel the vein, you need to know it's there." Grace closed her eyes for a beat. Amid the noise, the panic, the shouting, she visualized the anatomy. She'd studied it 1,000 times. The landmarks, the angles, the depth of tissue from skin to vein. She took a deep breath, gripped the catheter, and inserted it. Click, flashback, blood draw. The line was in. Perfect placement. One of the residents murmured, "She nailed it." Epinephrine flooded the IV. A second nurse continued compressions. And slowly, like the fragile rhythm of a rainstorm returning, the monitor beeped. Once, then again. A pulse. He was alive. The team exhaled. The trauma lid gave a small nod to Grace, but Grace didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just looked down at her numb hands. Still trembling, still disconnected. But they had done what they were never supposed to do. They saved a life. Later that night, when the shift was over and the hallways quieted, Grace sat alone in the staff lounge, gloves off, palms open, still no feeling. But in her heart, there was something more important than sensation: certainty. She could do this, not just survive the ICU, not just keep up, but lead. What Grace didn't know was that word of that moment, of that impossible 4, would ripple far beyond that trauma room and reach people she never expected to touch. Grace never told anyone what that night meant to her. She didn't frame the chart or keep a memento. She simply clocked in the next shift, like she always did. Quiet, steady, reliable. But the hospital remembered. So did the staff. The trauma lead brought it up during rounds. She got that line and under pressure, no gloves, no feedback, just skill. Suddenly, people saw Grace differently, not as a nurse with a limitation, but as the one who had mastered something most took for granted, and the story didn't stay contained. A medical student wrote about her in a reflective assignment. An attending mentioned her during a seminar on adaptive care. And then something unexpected happened. Emails started trickling in from across the country, from across oceans. I have tremors. I didn't think I could be a nurse. I'm deaf. No one in my program believes I can do this. I have a spinal condition. Thank you for showing me it's possible. Grace hadn't set out to be an example, but she had become one, not for overcoming, but for redefining. She started replying to each message late at night after shifts, offering techniques, encouragement, resources, telling them what no one had told her. There's more than one way to heal. Your way matters too. Soon, her inbox grew too full, so she created a small mentorship circle, virtual at first, 5 students, then 10, then 30. They called themselves the Unseen Hands, a support group for nurses with disabilities and chronic conditions, not a club of exceptions, but a coalition of innovators. They shared everything: alternative techniques, modified tools, tips on pacing energy through chronic fatigue, scripts for self-advocacy during clinical evaluations. Grace became their quiet leader, and when a local university invited her to guest lecture on inclusive care, she walked to the podium, hands still numb, but voice steady. She said, "We don't need to change the definition of care. We just need to remember that care was never meant to be one size fits all." That talk led to another and another. Eventually, she co-founded the state's first inclusive nursing fellowship, designed to train, empower, and place nurses of all abilities. Hospitals began listening, schools began adapting, and lives, both patient and practitioner, began transforming. All because one woman refused to let silence in her hands turn into silence in her soul. But for Grace, the most meaningful ripple wasn't a fellowship. It was a moment far more personal, in a room filled with quiet machines and long goodbyes. The hospital had seen its share of goodbyes, but this one felt different, more intimate, more sacred. Grace stood outside room 12 just before dawn, her badge still clipped to her scrubs. But tonight she wasn't here as a nurse. She was here as a daughter. Her father, Hideo Ito, once a stern, strong man who built houses with his bare hands, now lay motionless beneath white sheets, his body frail and bones too thin for the man she remembered. He had fought stomach cancer for 3 years, the same man who once told her, "Nursing is for women with gentle hands," who shook his head when she first applied to nursing school, who believed in tradition, in strength, in roles that didn't shift. And yet, when he got sick, it was Grace who cared for him most. She was the one who tracked every lab result, adjusted his feeding pump, sat with him through chemo and nausea and silence. He never said much about it, but his eyes softened little by little, like he was unlearning the shape of his own pride. Now, as the monitor beside his bed slowed to a whisper, Grace pulled up a chair. She reached for his hand, still strong, still calloused. But hers? She couldn't feel his skin, couldn't feel the rough texture that used to build furniture and fix leaky sinks. And for a second, that hurt. She wanted to feel this moment, to know the shape of goodbye, to memorize his warmth the way children memorize lullabies. But all she had was numbness. Still, she held on, and then she leaned close and whispered, Dad, you don't have to be strong anymore. I'll be strong for you. You are always my why. Even when you didn't believe in me, I wanted to make you proud. A single tear ran down his cheek. He blinked, looked into her eyes, and with a final breath, he said what she'd waited years to hear. You already did. Then the monitor fell silent. No alarms, no panic, just stillness. Grace stayed there for hours, hand in hand. Even if she couldn't feel the warmth, she could feel the weight of what had been said, because sometimes the most powerful goodbyes aren't spoken with lips. They're passed through presence, through forgiveness, through being there when it matters most. And in that final room, Grace didn't need sensation. She had something far greater: closure, connection, love. They called her limited, said she couldn't feel pain, so how could she ever recognize it in others? Said her hands were broken, so her care must be too. But Grace Ito proved something few ever dare to believe. That true care doesn't start in the fingertips. It starts in the heart. She couldn't feel warmth, but she made others feel safe. She couldn't sense pressure, but she carried others through it. And when the world tried to tell her she wasn't enough, she became more than anyone expected. Her patients didn't remember her for her touch. They remembered her for the way she sat beside them, for the way her eyes softened pain, for the way her presence said, "You matter. You're not alone." Grace never chased perfection. She chose presence. She never asked to be an example. She simply refused to walk away from what she loved. Even when it hurt, even when it was hard, even when no one thought she could. And in doing so, she changed not only her life, but the lives of those who thought they had no place in the healing world. Because disability isn't the absence of ability, it's the presence of a different kind of strength. So if you've ever been told you're not built for it, if someone looked at your body, your diagnosis, your struggle, and tried to write your ending for you, let this be your reminder. You get to choose what story you write next. And if Grace's story touched you, please don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe for more stories like this. Share a comment below about someone who's cared for you in a way you'll never forget. Send this to someone who needs to remember that they are not their limitations. They are their love, their effort, their presence. This is able in every way. Where stories prove that strength takes many forms, and care, when it's real, always finds a way.